Okay, guys. So we've had, you just heard from John clearly, and we've had Amy here before as well. Early on to kind of talk through some ideas on realignment to our writing section. But I wanted to, in this near the end, kind of talk to some people who could give us some ideas and help us think through the story ideas that we think are big. So what I would like is, is to make this really free form and open and hear from you guys about the things you think are important, the things you guys have kind of found interesting and worthy of coverage. And I would kind of like, and Amy's teaming with ideas, and I'm sure John is too, but I would like, to the degree possible, Amy to kind of give us like the policy implications, and then John talk to us about what are the journalistic realities of telling that story and whether or not it actually has any viability. So, I think that way we can kind of get to a point where we're taking the policy and the journalism and putting them together. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, the one thing we've successfully done is shoved an excessive amount of knowledge down everybody's throat here. And I'd be very curious just to hear what people thought has risen to the top of what's really the most interesting, what haven't you seen other places. You guys are all now somewhat experts and very up to date on this field, and so we're really curious to hear.
Just to add, when I've been reading all your guys' stuff as it comes in, and I'm really, more than anything, I'm really just been consistently impressed with the amount of knowledge you guys have about pretty complicated and kind of deep foster care knowledge, deep knowledge about the way the system works, and that's stuff that I remember took me years, and I feel like a lot of you of course studied social welfare and other things, but it's been really impressive how much you guys have absorbed that. So I just want to say, hey, I'm pretty impressed. So, does anybody have any, what's burbled to the top? Anybody? Wow.
Starting in with questions?
Yeah, I mean, is that okay?
Whatever format you want, Daniel, works for me.
Is that okay? What's burbled to the top, you guys?
I think for me, it's changed over throughout the course of the semester. I became really engulfed in learning more about the juvenile dependency courts and its effect. And then as I started looking into it different, then I became really interested in AB 12 again and the budget differences and the deficits and how that affects the money, how it affects AB 12. But I think within the past couple of weeks when, I can't think of her name, I'm so bad with names, but she came from the Stewart Foundation. We just had this whole class about education for foster youth, and that really sparked my interest about non-traditional schools and the different settings that they were put in and the different, the challenges they face academically and to get that type of funding and that type of help there. So that's one of the things that really just jumped to the forefront for me, of just learning more about just education for foster youth and how the system plays a role into that and stuff. So
what's going on policy-wise in terms of education in 2012, and what should we be watching out for, and what would be a scintillating or whatever story coming out of that?
Well, there is a bill that's been introduced by the California Youth Connection, which is a youth membership organization of current and former foster youth that is to create a kind of educational liaison currently at every CSU. And the idea there is to ensure that there's a academic support available to youth who arrive in post-secondary education in California. So just as a little backstory, this is something that the Stewart Foundation, through their work, they started by doing a lot of charitable giving and creating these Guardian Scholars programs. And the thinking was to create a program within a campus. But then the kind of model changed to try and, instead of doing that, try to integrate more with the post-secondary education institution. Because kind of the cost per boutique program that sat on top of the campus was so high. However, that kind of change in thinking came at the same time as the budget fiasco. And so now CYC has introduced this bill, and it's a tension between, we love and care about children and youth in foster care, but relative to the student population in community colleges, CSUs, and UCs, they're literally needles in a haystack. And so there's a very fair policy question, even for someone like me who has, blinders almost to the world, except for kids in foster care sometimes, about how can we, in our current fiscal environment, how do we responsibly balance the kind of offerings to children and youth who make it to post-secondary ed with a whole range of very needy populations. And so that's a conversation that will happen in the state legislature as this bill moves through its policy and fiscal committees. And they're trying to get it scored somehow as cost neutral. So that's interesting when you're, by finding a person within, basically someone on campus that they can just assign to this role. So that's kind of the most, from my point of view, at least one policy issue that's directly related to that.
So scored as cost neutral means
that they can get the Department of Finance or the fiscal committees of the legislature to say this does not cost any money. Which, there's always a tension, of course, when you're running a bill, you want it to be scored cost neutral, but if something's cost neutral, it doesn't mean, it's again, a different tension, but you want it to be scored cost neutral until it passes, and then you want to say, no, we really have to do this.
Yeah.
So.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot going on with education, particularly in the implementation of laws that have been passed, as to how well those are really working for foster youth. I know the Cage bill, one of the issues is that the legislature has basically, within the past years, passed a bill that was designed to make it easier when you transfer into a new school, which, as I'm sure you know from this class, when you're a foster youth, oftentimes you're transferring a amount of times, and there's nothing more disruptive to a young person's education than to have to go to a new school and start over. I like to think when you're trying to evaluate the challenges that foster youth face, you compare it against the baseline of what other families face. And think of how many people, how many parents will bypass an opportunity for a better job, will live in a particular, will live in a smaller house or do what they can so that one, that their child is in a good school, but also that they have that continuity. Something people in my age range, oftentimes I'll hear somebody say, yeah, I really have this job offer, but I can't go because of my kids. Well, just think of these, foster kids who are transferring, 6, 8, 10 times, within their a relatively short few years. So there was a bill a couple of years ago that was designed to basically make it that they would break down a lot of those barriers, like in terms of, not having to wait until all the records are there, and maybe a presumption when they show up in a new district that they will get into school and worry about the paperwork later, because we all know if you miss several weeks, a month of school, you're behind and you may never catch up that school year. But there's some real problems there with the implementation that they're working on. I know at the higher ed level, one of the issues that I'm hearing about from some people who are involved with working with former foster youth who are going to college is that there was a law that the legislature passed that makes it when you're an emancipated foster youth that you should have priority in registration. Same way the guys who are playing for the Colorado football team or whatever getting priority registration.
Like veterans.
Yeah, there are a number of categories. And my understanding that this particular academic year that was optional in the CSU system and UC was exempt. Well, there was some reason for UC to be exempt, as the reality is, they didn't want to do it, and UC has a lot of sway. But the other thing is, in terms of practical reality, there's many more former foster youth in CSUs than UC. But this year was optional on CSU campuses, and there's one thing about higher ed administrators is they take seriously optional being optional, So it's supposed to be mandatory next year, but there's a real question as to how well that will work. So a lot of times we passed an AB 12 as an example of where a law that was passed that we hardly supported, and Amy was on me all the time, making sure that we kept up with all the developments on it. But then there's been some real questions about how that's being implemented as to whether the at the county level that they are seeing that as additional money, which was the design that you by doing this there would be more resources going in instead of just replacing existing resources for young people in transitional housing.
Well, and I would say, related to that, I think it's the general point about all your stories and your lives as journalists is, I think it's a lot easier to cover something as it's passing. I mean, I'm not a journalist, but I mean, as an advocate, tracking a bill as it's going through the official process, it's all very structured, but it's extremely hard to cover something in the implementation. And that's where the real value is. What John's saying about AB 490 around the transfer of credits, I mean, that is where you can add a tremendous amount of value to your community, because the legislators are a policy-making body. They have passed the policy. They have formally completed their function. It's now to the administration to implement it. And for marginal groups like this that do not have a lot of organizing capacity, things simply don't get implemented. And so you can really shine a light on that and help tremendously.
Amy is being kinder to the legislature than I would be. Because I think that they also have an obligation after passing laws to hold hearings and make sure that what has been passed is being implemented. In the California legislature this week, there are 665 bills that are going to have committee hearings this week in the California legislature. They have too many bills. They have no discipline up there. And the fact is, you know, there's 120 legislators. Even if you divide them up, I'm sorry, the average that they will be considering, they are going to be, because they're concentrated, they're not even working this Friday. So they're going to be averaging 21 bills an hour going through the legislature.
Whoa.
Wow. And my contention, and you'll see in tomorrow's editorial page, is they ought to be doing fewer things
Yeah.
and making sure that they're doing it right.
Well, I mean, so how? I mean, that's a great point. I mean, these like, was it you, Amy, who was talking to me about like how they got quotas? I mean, or quotas where you got to file a certain amount of bills every.
Well, just the average legislator has 20 bills, and so part of your work as an advocate is to advocate with your own author. I mean, I kind of wish this were clear. Like an author has a bill and they have a certain amount of political capital to expend, and so often, you know, you'll actually be working to get, and you know, in behind the doors when you're in an appropriations committee, they have to make hard decisions about where they place that political capital and what they move forward, and having all these bills just dilutes the political capital. You want to know when you are working with someone, as we all do, you know, what you're doing with them falls on the priority list. And so it's interesting because you think as an advocate you're out there converting people, but sometimes it's bringing the influence to a person who's actually a bill author. So I am in total agreement. I think we should have a year with no new bills.
Oh,
and that is actually been part of my feeling about Oakland City Council. No new ordinances. Let's push down what we've done. And that's not popular, and everyone thinks that they like that idea until it's their issue. Yeah. And then they want a bill. So it's not easy to stop this way of thinking.
Are there any political leaders who are very good at delegislating, or not delegislating, but just stopping, slowing down and saying like, hey, our responsibility is not to make perpetual laws? I mean, this is like that famous Plato line where, you know, society's messed up if you've got too many doctors or too many lawyers. In the latter case, it's because there's so many laws, people don't understand how to navigate it themselves anymore, because there's so many politicians making all these laws. So is there anybody who's good on this stuff?
I think the system's rigged against it because you need to go back to your constituents and kind of show them what you've done. And when you're a legislator, unfortunately, that's what you get the most credit for.
Or fundraising. Fundraising, you carry somebody's bill, and even if it doesn't go anywhere, there's some reward. I would say that I think, especially from the leadership, they'll pay lip service to this issue. I mean, over the years, you know, I've brought this up with no shortage of legislative leaders, and they'll talk about, yeah, we have committee bills, we need to constrain it, but it really doesn't happen. But I will say this though on foster care, I think this issue has been very fortunate to have some really terrific leadership in Sacramento. Darrell Steinberg, who's the Senate President Pro Tem, he's been very strong on this issue. Karen Bass, before she went to Congress, when she was in the state legislature, was just a terrific advocate. Jim Beal, and Amy's good friend and colleague, former Senate President Pro Tem John Burton. Even though he's not in the legislature right now, he is a true believer and committed to this issue. And I know when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor that John Burke not only worked on some of his former colleagues in the legislature, he worked on Arnold as well, and I think to some great effect.
Well, here we go.
I'm interested in how coverage of realignment is going to play out. Kind of jumping off the point about legislation versus implementation. If you're looking at something that's going to really very much unfold at the local level, and it seems as though maybe local level journalism isn't what it used to be, at least in print, in some parts of the state. If really there's going to be reporting that's going to uncover troublesome issues that might come up and inequities among counties and implementation.
I actually think local level journalism has suffered less than other types of journalism. I'm actually fairly confident, especially when you break it out into 58 counties. The reporters in Chico may not be doing a great deal of investigative reporting on Barstow, but they sure know what's going on at the county level and hear from the board of supervisors and the sheriff and the DA. So I think there will be a great deal of coverage, and also I think the advocacy groups across the board. I think there's going to be no shortage of coverage of what's happening at the local level. I think where it sometimes becomes more problematic is the bigger picture. These organizations' ability to really, if everything's going on, if everything is going well in a particular major metropolitan area, do they really know what's going on in San Francisco? Do we know what's going on in Los Angeles? And it may be sort of spotty, but I think it's going to be a huge covered story. I don't think it's going to be some stories you worry about because they're, this is definitely complex, but it's not hidden. If the result of this realignment is that you have jails overcrowding, that's not a story that generally gets overlooked in any community.
I got one quote you, Amy.
What's that?
I got Amy. So what's interesting is like in this new world, like the advocates have the opportunity to also kind of share their ideas, and so Amy's been really kind of leading the charge with a lot of good blogging. I don't know if you've been reading that, John, some of her John Burton Foundation blogs, but this question of realignment she just wrote today, which I thought was pretty accurate. Counties are now left with a funding stream set by how much stuff Californians buy at their local mall. Call me crazy, but this doesn't sound like a very responsible way to manage a program for our most vulnerable children. So, Amy's out there doing it, but I think you're right. There's not that many people who get the whole state context.
Well, I think my concern is there has been a certain level of attention to criminal justice or public safety realignment. I have not seen it as very critical, like a very critical analysis. I'm concerned with the level of compliance on the part of our fourth estate in these statements that are made, even calling it realignment, no quotes. This is a label. This is a political term that's been assigned to it, and so I hope I am wrong, but around child welfare, the unseen effect of realignment child welfare may well be a reduced caseload in the face of increased child maltreatment. So that is a very hard thing to see, and the people who are subject to that maltreatment are low-income children of color. So they're not a group that we are particularly great at responding to already. So my hope is that we can build in the legislation some strong accountability measures so that we can measure the public health of the community and not go 20 years down the line as we have with TANF, welfare reform, and say, wow, this system stopped being responsive to poverty. But I think the people who can make sure we don't go that long are, like, even the work of the LA Times reporter that, Daniel has mixed feelings about, but with these child deaths. I mean, LA County did a realignment-like experiment, and they have there's been some questions about child deaths. I mean, someone has to raise these questions, and the directors of child welfare agencies hate that, but that is the job. And if you do not like that, then do not be a child welfare director. I mean, simply, it's just too important of an issue. And it has to be done responsibly, of course, but to me, that is, that's the only kind of hope we have in some ways, because on the state level, the state is so dominated and defeated that it is not available to oversee these programs. The counties have won the war, and if there are not kind of local journalists who are being extremely critical and probing and not believing anything at face value, then we could really see, and we could see children be harmed. So that's my strong appeal to get in there and don't let anyone get anything by you.
We'll see when Amy's elected to Oakland City Council whether this said don't take anything at face value. We're still saying that a couple years ago. But just one quick point on realignment. I know you don't like the word, but what should we call it, the pass the buck scheme?
Right. The assignment, I like to call it.
But one thing, in some ways, when it comes to child welfare, it's back to the future, which the past was not very good on it. I mean, one of the whole driving forces behind foster care reform in the late 2008, 2007 was that there were such tremendous disparities from county to county on what resources and levels of support were available to young people. So we may well go back into that unfortunate era.
Next questions. Wendy?
Mine is also building on that with realignment. I just think it's an interesting process because I've kind of been following it for a while now, and I know that it started with just there was no traction around this kind of conversation around it, and increasingly, partially due to your work, there's been increasing dialogue around it. So I think from a process perspective, that's interesting, but also the child welfare side isn't getting news coverage, really, and I'm just curious what about the story you guys could identify either as strategies to make it more appealing to the media, and like you said, the title itself is just so kind of neutral and not kind of confusing, that it doesn't really engender a lot of passion from people or understanding. But I'm just wondering about that, what different ways to frame the story would make it more have more traction, and also if there's been, obviously you've had a lot of success building it up, Amy, so just what your experience and what's been successful around that. Well, for both of you.
Well, I think that one thing is, there really are not a lot of children's advocates. Honestly, I don't think we did anything magical. I mean, there are very, very few of them in the state, and they all work for very small organizations that have very limited bandwidth. So I thought that there, when I worked at First Place, I was just like, there are people and they've got it all figured out. There are not a lot of children's advocates, and on the federal level, it's even more sparse. And so being one of the biggest challenges is how to be extremely strategic. There's very little capacity, and how to evaluate opportunities to say, given what I have, which is John Burton's ear and a certain level of expertise, what do I invest in to actually make a difference? And so I don't think, I think we worked and tried to convince some people to care about this, but that's just a major problem. Is there's too many small organizations There's not enough philanthropy dollars in advocacy because there's more of an interest in giving it to kids in beds, which I understand that's incredibly compelling. But in my opinion, the whole sector needs to build up. And how this relates to realignment is now that all the advocacy is really pushed to the county level, it really has implications, because instead of, we used to be able to like fight the THP plus fight at the state level. The THP plus fight in this housing program is going to be fought 58 times over. And you've got a lot of providers who are kind of just, the level at which they engage is there's like an RFP, a request for proposal posted, and they respond to it. That's about the level of engagement with the Board of Supervisors they had. Now we're going to have to teach them how to swim upstream to get involved in hearings before priorities are even set. I mean, the implications on the county level for building the capacity of advocacy organizations, and how nonprofit providers who are excellent in the service of people now are going to have to add this function. Because if they don't, their lunch is going to get eaten. And so that's kind of, you know, somewhat addressing your question, but certainly not why the media coverage hasn't been equal. Because the amount of money realigned is equal. The child welfare side is financially equal to the public protection. Because some people have said that, it's just like, well, the public protection so much more was realigned. No, it wasn't. So I'm very curious what your thoughts are, John, like why it hasn't captured the public imagination.
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask in some way, because, I mean, certainly, you know, why isn't foster care getting enough attention? I mean, certainly on our pages it's gotten a lot of attention, disproportionate probably to other issues, because we think it's an important issue. I think the key, it goes back to what we were talking about in the previous session, and that's about finding ways to humanize, first of all, humanize the young people who are in the system. But also, I think, in terms of engaging people who may be not predisposed to, you know, be engaged in child welfare issues, is the connection of the failure of the child welfare system with every other issue that we care about. Mm-hmm. You look at homelessness, there's a direct connection. You look at the failures of our education system, which in some ways the education system is working in some narrow ways phenomenally well, but overall we have so many young people falling behind. You look at the criminal justice system and its connection with prison overcrowding, the percentage of inmates who at one point in their lives have been in foster care. I think, to me, it transcends left-right, transcends any other type of label. I don't see why any, you know, California who may not even care about the human condition would not be concerned about what's happening in foster care, because we're paying such a tremendous price in so many ways when it's not what it should be. So for me, like, how do you frame the issue? That's how I see framing it.
I just want, you know, with this idea, and Amy and I were talking about it today, because we kind of, there's this question of these bubble kids. So those kids, you very, in one of your pieces when you were writing about AB 12, and you kind of break down, how it works, and you say, this was you last year, eligibility will expand to 20-year-olds in 2013, 21-year-olds in 2014, and then we'll see, if the legislature wants to get to 21-year-olds. And you wrote that very plainly, but what that means for real kids is that there's that bubble, right? And Amy and I, we've been talking about this quite a bit, and that bubble where at 19 you're going to lose your eligibility. Okay, you have to draw a line in the sand at some point. But to this realignment thing, it's, so I'm writing about this bubble, these bubble kids, because it's interesting. Like, it's an interesting story, and it's interesting that the sausage making of policy on the state level had resulted in about 3,000, Anna and I are trying to figure out, kids across the state that will turn 19 in this year that will be, excluded from this thing that all these politicians got this big fanfare about passing. Fine. But when you really put it in big context, and Amy and I were talking about, I talked to Jill, of course, our esteemed teacher at the School of Social Welfare, and what she said, which I thought was very accurate, was, under realignment / devolution, this will be the story where counties are making decisions against the interest of kids, essentially, for the next decade or more. So I think that you can start, as we go forward and we find these pinpointed things where money decisions are being made, you just put it in, under the backdrop of the future, wherein, you know, we can start looking at what Amy's done in terms of looking at sales tax versus inflation and those kind of ideas, and you can just kind of start saying there's a finite amount of money and these decisions are being made. And so I think you can almost, you know, get good at inserting that as the backdrop to a lot of the foster care coverage, period.
You know, really is been pointed out to be a number of times. I mean, you know, so much of child welfare is really about rationing, unfortunately, because they're not the level of resources that there should be. And this whole thing of, it's been frustrating for me in trying to find out what's going on with the implementation of AB 12 and the confluence of THP Plus and THP Plus FC, which are a couple acronyms you never seen in any of my cases. But still, you have this situation where you have people who are directors of social services who are trying to, you know, assuage the concerns. Oh, no children left behind. We're going to find a way to do it. But there's already some suggestion that there is going to be that new federal money is just going to be backfilling what they're losing from the state. So, you know, it's a little early to tell.
Well, I think the issue really, to me, I just, you know, raised this with a lot of meeting with state legislators, and they don't like it framed this way, but I think that the question has to be asked is, why did the state get out of the business of child welfare? This policy area has been, shifted to the counties. Now, and the one way to look at it is like it's shifted to counties is flexible, but why, if I were an elected official, would I now want to have lots of opinions about THP Plus and lots of opinions and lots of discretion about these programs? I want to increase THP Plus this year. I'd like to decrease kinship support services. I was elected because I want to bring my judgment and my knowledge and the interests of my constituents to these programs. Through realignment, the state legislature has carved out a huge piece of policy and said we don't do that. And I think that is a very curious decision for a legislature to make. And I think it also is not done. We had a hearing last week, and more or less, realignment is just revving up. And so then we take a government, the concept of a state government, and we've taken out, a big part of criminal justice, and we've taken out a big part of child welfare services. This is a great way. We're essentially, what will be left? What will be left is education, because with Prop 98. But I mean, it's just a fundamental change in what state government is, and for someone who thinks a lot about the state government, it kind of is mind-blowing. And the legislature's response to that is like, we're not done being involved in child welfare. We'll keep passing bills. Don't worry about that. But the reality is, if the governor's proposition passes, then the state is 100% responsible for the cost of any new child welfare mandates. That is a bill killer with the Department of Finance. If the proposition does not pass, the counties are accountable for any new mandates from new legislation. That is a bill killer. So I am definitely at times a little bit, maybe dramatic, but we are in the golden era of child welfare right now. The expansion, the enrichment of the program, as we saw through AB 12, that will never pass under this new environment. Who's going to foot the bill? The counties don't want to foot it with their existing realigned revenue, and the state doesn't want to foot the bill because they don't do child welfare anymore. So, that's the past. As I'm regularly reminded, Amy, realignment's done, shut up. But what's next? What is the next thing to be realigned? And we need to be ready, and we need to act much earlier. Much earlier. And the thing that I would predict, if I could just finish this, is so we have child-only TANF grants. My prediction is those are going to be taken out of TANF, put into the general fund, and realigned. And so this is, if you know and care about welfare policy, this is one of the hallmarks of California's welfare program is we say you have a right to live, even if you do not, we will give you money even if you do not have a job. In some states like Arizona, you can just, no one your family is eligible for TANF. Like you can be a family and have no right to anything. And so this is like an extremely important safety net program, child-only TANF grants. And if it does go into the state general fund and then get realigned, we're really looking at a fundamental change in the values of California.
Well, listen to what she says now, because I can remember meeting with Amy in 2010, or if that, 2009, no, it was 2010, early 2010, and she was talking about Schwartz and then Schwarzenegger, talking about this thing called realignment. And talking about this crazy jacked up thing that could be coming our way and getting very passionate about it.
Well, and he wanted to only realign $500 million, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And when he proposed it, the LAO witnesses said it was crazy. And then Jerry Brown comes with a $1.6 billion realignment package, and it sails through the legislature.
So about this idea of being vigilant ahead of time, you know.
Hopefully I'm wrong. I mean, I would love to be wrong about that.
Yes.
I guess I have two thoughts. I don't know if they intersect at all. But I guess my one thought was this, you were talking about, well, how do we, going back to a few minutes ago, how do we get more coverage of child welfare? And then I believe, Jen, you mentioned this idea of, well, we need to link it to the consequences for society. And I'm just wondering if in our culture today we're too myopic to even if we did that, to make people care about it. Like, I don't know, like, it's hard for me sometimes to understand where people are coming from, whether they don't care about child welfare issues, or they don't respond to it, or does it resonate with them. And I just can't help but think it just seems like our culture is so myopic. I mean, if you look at Wall Street and the way that Wall Street is run, people are looking in the short term to make money. I mean, people are so focused on the near term that I really wonder if how that strategy would be effective, of linking it to, well, if we don't do something now, 15 years down the road, you're going to feel the impact. So it's just more of a comment. My second kind of idea is I wonder if there's not some opportunity in this realignment, Amy, because you mentioned this idea that now the nonprofits are going to have to become advocates. And there may be opportunity in that. If you find that all these nonprofits now finally are having to advocate for themselves, maybe now they have a stronger voice, and maybe it may be easier for, somebody in a leadership position to organize and really organize that group and have more powerful of a unified voice. I don't know, like, this is all very conceptual, and this is like what I like to talk, not in realities, but in concept. But I don't know, what are your thoughts? Do you think that could be, something some good that can come out of this? Is some stronger advocates and more advocates at the ground level?
I hope. I mean, I think one of the weaknesses of state level advocates is, I came from a practitioner's point of view, and it's just like the legislative session would start, and people are like, what ideas do we have? I'm like, what ideas do we have? What do we know? I mean, well, what do you know? You've never even served anyone. It's all very easy. It seems easy. So, all these ideas, we can be as guilty, frankly, as the legislators of just kind of running bills. And so I think you make a very good point. I mean, these are people who serve people in the community. They understand why problems are complex. And when they bring their wisdom to problems, there's a lot more value to it. And I hope we can work to get them the support. I mean, I work with a lot of very overwhelmed organizations. And, they don't know how government works, but this is a good rationale to start learning. And I think that would be a wonderful outcome, and it's what has to happen. And the question is how they can get ahead of it, so that the bad decisions, so they're not reacting to decisions that are made.
I'm focusing on the point that you made, which I think is a really good one, about how myopic we can be both in politics and in media. I would take that to another degree and say in some ways we're very episodic. I mean, something will come up, and you can see this happening with so many issues, whether it's race relations or child welfare, or something happens, and suddenly the society, the politicians, the press, is totally consumed. Suddenly, some, cute kid in foster care gets in a predicament, and the nation adopts him or her as their own. The cover of Time, cover of Newsweek, on cable, they're putting the politicians up. Why aren't we doing something about child welfare? And it goes on for maybe several weeks, or a month, 2 months, maybe if it's extraordinary. The way we see with so many issues, and then okay, we move on. We've kind of done that. I think that's a real problem, and I think it is a problem in the media, I would acknowledge. I think it's also a problem in the political world, and partly because of term limits in the state legislature, is that you have legislators who don't feel, it's not that they don't care about the future, but they don't have the same stake in the future that they would have if there was even a possibility that they would be in the legislature 4 or 5 years from now. And they simply, the members are there a maximum of 6 years. People become leaders after 2 years. The leadership is people who barely learn their way around the Capitol building. So I mean, the last thing, and you not just see it with child welfare, you see it with things like pension reform and these other planning, where you really, they're not thinking about this is going to come back to haunt me. It's my opinion.
I just want to say one example about how the short-term thing, though. It's kind of a funny story. So when we make that case about how we're going to, end juvenile incarceration and homelessness and better health outcomes and better educational outcomes, and actually had the preeminent researcher who came to the class, Mark Courtney, who did a formal cost-benefit analysis. I mean, that's kind of the gold standard as an advocate. You're not just making up your own stuff. You're like, Mark Courtney says. And the response from the Department of Finance is, these aren't general fund savings this year. That's what they want, general fund savings, not just savings. Savings to the state general fund in the fiscal year. So to your point, it's that is absolutely an issue. Like the idea that these are California's children, these are California's workers, these are California's future parents. It's like, what does this mean for our state budget to the state general fund in the year we are in? And we have to get out of that kind of thinking. I totally agree with John that a lot of that is driven by the just very short-term nature of legislators and the extreme breadth, of issues they deal with. It's unbelievable. How much they've got to become
65 bills this week,
Yeah.
So 2 questions right along with that. So first question would be, David Karp, right, last week said that everyone is a Democrat until they are dealing with their own kids, and then they're Republicans, or progressive until you're I don't want my kid to have that happen to them, right? So what has been the most successful strategies that both of you have used to make it so that people who don't have direct access to working with kids in foster care actually care about the issue? What has been your most successful way of making people care in both of your careers? Am I asking that in a clear way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I look at it is, I look at these statistics. I think, first of all, I think people can empathize and relate with the responsibilities of parenthood. And one of the things that we've done, it's almost become a mantra, and I do it to jar the consciousness of readers, is one of the things that you'll see as a common refrain in our editorials, that these are our children and our collective responsibility. And as I look at, my priorities in life, and I think this is true with all, parents, is that if you looked at these statistics and say that, your child is more, and these are our children, is many times more likely to end up homeless or in prison than graduating from college. And you look at all these other statistics that are associated with outcomes, as they say in social services world, for emancipated foster youth. And I hate that. You never see that term emancipated in our editorials. Because if that is emancipation, I think that is the ultimate oxymoron to call that emancipation when you look at what happens. But you figure if you looked at a parent, that those are the odds of what is going to happen to your child, there would be nothing in your life that would be more important than reversing those numbers. And we've made that point. And also, again, even if you're just a totally callous human being and hate kids and they're nuisance and whatnot, I mean, the cost of supporting a foster child and giving them a chance at education and opportunity versus the cost of a failed outcome, if you will. I mean, every conservative Republican who hates taxes and is going to stymie Brown at every turn, they ought to be on the forefront of this. It's a fiscal conservative issue. So I disagree with, was it David Kirk who came in and said
Well, I think he was saying basically you're progressive until it comes to your own family. Right. And so not knowing how to, I guess that struck me as not knowing how to address that concern of until it comes to your own zip code, right? It is how do you make people who don't have to see, don't have the opportunity to see the human side of it.
Yeah, I just would say that there's nobody who in this society who is disengaged who can fully disassociate themselves from what happens when the child welfare system is not giving young people an opportunity.
Can I ask a follow-up question as well? So, one thing that was also discussed last week in a child policy kind of focus is labeling legislators as for kids or anti-kids. What is your opinion on that? Given their kind of histories and I think
if I can contextualize, I think David, I heard him speak about this, was saying that child advocates play teddy bear politics, and that we need to kind of, or Ted Lampert was saying this, bring the pain and be willing to kind of lay it down and just be like, you're anti-kid. And as a former legislator, he was saying, that we let these people off way too easy, and that we don't just kind of organize to take someone out and show that there is a price to pay politically for being anti-kid, and kind of that as a strategy versus I think what is more common is to take the moral high ground to say we don't play ball like that. Just to give a little context to your question.
See, our editorial page would not use the anti-kid because I think politics is too polarized anyway, and whether it's the war on women or this or that, I think I don't think any legislator is really anti-kid. I just think they empathize through.
But I think it's
so our
fair.
job is to make them think it through.
Sorry, but I think it's fair to point out. You were very good at that too. I mean, pointing out what it means. And then you did that with other politicians. But I think that's totally fair. You should be able to embarrass them.
Yeah. Public shaming is one of the roles of the editorial page. Like more than once at editorial board meeting, I say, that politician has just earned his picture in tomorrow's newspaper with an email address.
Well, one thing I would just like to say about your first question, is I think it'd be very interesting to take some time to think about the parents from whom these children are removed. I'm on a Blue Ribbon Commission appointed by the state Supreme Court Justice, and there's 35 of us or 40 of us, and there's not a single biological parent representative. So 15 years ago, we realized, we gotta start listening to those kids, and CYC came around and they started helping us understand. And the reason why we understand is we heard from them. And I think it's time to turn to the biological parents. And I think that one reason why it remains an inaccessible kind of issue is you think these people are monsters. They've abused or neglected their children, when in reality, it's not that simple. And so to build the empathy and the understanding as between parents, and I think if we could do that, I think that would be a movement forward. But that effort is not even underway in any way, shape, or form. And still, biological parents, when they show up at a hearing, it's like you've seen a Lorax or something. They're extremely wow. They're very not present in the policy discourse. And these are the people whose children are being taken away. I mean, I have 2 children. If someone tried to take away my kids, we would have some trouble, you know, and they love their children as much as I love my children. So I feel like there's a lot there that we need to think about, and I just think it'd be extremely interesting journalism.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I'm saying, a lot of talking about is that there's a lot of possibility for looking at policies like AB 12 realignment and seeing how they affect specific groups. So for instance, looking at AB 12 and say, you know, I can also analyze it from a broad perspective, look how it's affecting everyone. But say targeting foster parents, like parents that are parenting at age 18 to 19, and seeing how AB 12 can affect that population specifically. So possibly trying to limit the scope to have a broader effect and see specifically how this group is going to be affected by policy and kind of holding the message.
That's a really good idea, and that's one way to get to your point on really bringing the issue home to people.
We were kind of regretting the fact that the last time we had you here, I mean, right after Mark Courtney and Trey Bundy were here, and they were not totally opposed to realignment. And we wished we'd had you in the same room. And, you know, in the first half, we had a description of why it's important to not present only one-sided information. So I wonder if you could give us a sense of, you know, what is Mark Courtney thinking? Clearly, you know, he's an intelligent guy, and there is support of realignment, and I'm just curious, you know, how do you cover that in a meaningful way? And is there a unified voice among advocates, or is there dissension, and what might that mean in terms of coverage?
Well, I think the rap that an advocate will get is that, you know, you guys are just downers. You're always thinking things are going to go wrong. Like you're really thinking about the worst case scenario. And that kind of, in some ways, is the job. And unapologetically, like, capitalism is not kind to, you know, low-income people of color generally. You know, like, so thinking through things and trying to imagine how this could play out for groups of people that very few people generally think about. And so the kind of response to realignment is just like, the county's already running anyway. This is just kind of formalizing it. It'll be okay. And I think the truth is, in some ways, that's a fair assessment. And I think really for the next 5 years, the system could actually, you know, get some growth money. And I could have a little egg on my face. I'm not thinking about 5 years. I'm thinking about 50 years. I'm thinking about my grandchildren, if my grandchildren would need our child welfare services. I mean, not to get too, like, you know, wavy gravy or whatever. But truthfully, this realignment is permanent. It's changed. It's never going to change back. It's how we have forever changed the system. And so that's kind of what we're thinking about. And that definitely is not what the legislature is thinking about. And we brought that up in meetings with legislators, and it's just not, it's not a frame that resonates, to say the least. And so I think in the short term, yeah, the counties, and what I always hear from CWDA is like, yeah, Amy, like child welfare's done great in the state general fund, because it did get a big $80 million veto a couple years ago. That's a very fair kind of criticism of kind of my position and the positions of people who are concerned about realignment. And yet, I still think in the long term, we could be in a very bad position. I mean, just due to population growth, if nothing else. And my whole thing is like, why are we doing casino policy making? Why are legislators willing to just roll the dice and hope the sales tax is high enough? That is not reasonable for these children, and they deserve more. And but unfortunately, that is a minority opinion.
You've been very patient back when you did that, but.
No, I wanted to kind of ask you guys what you thought, and also to kind of add in a comment, and it goes with in terms of coverage. Mostly this year I've been doing immigration and the foster care system, and they're very, very hard subjects to cover for obvious reasons. People are scared to talk to you, either because they feel like you're going to exploit their personal story, or you have an agenda when you're approaching them in terms of telling the story. So one thing that I found difficult is not talking to advocates, because advocates will talk to you, nonprofit organizations will talk to you, but you need the other side of the story. You need a response from county, you need a response from state, and child welfare service directors are very short with media. If they take your call, they're not likely to elaborate very much on your questions or, you know, say too much, because I guess maybe because of a concern of how their department will be portrayed in the story. So just what you guys think in terms of being someone on the side of child welfare, in terms of what are some of the things reporters can do to maybe help people be relaxed into this situation, that this is more about getting information from you instead of trying to use that information against you, if that makes sense.
Well, I think the county directors, I mean, my experience, they tend to be very defensive, oftentimes because they're on the defensive. And they may be, you know, like I think of some of those that I deal with. I mean, I think their heart's in the right place, and I think they're as frustrated as anybody that we talk to that is criticizing them. Yeah. But they have to, you know, they can't, they're not really in a position to talk against the policymakers in their particular counties. So I'm not surprised that you've had that experience. I mean, even at the Chronicle, we have that kind of experience oftentimes. And my suggestion would be, you know, particularly if you have somebody who you're having a hard time, you know, getting them to either return your calls or talk at length, try to talk to them in person. You know, make the effort. People tend to, in those kinds of situations, and that they see that you're making the extra effort to get their side of the story. But I think just the nature of things, you know, it's like the point that, you know, I made earlier about, you know, so much of, you know, social services, child welfare services is about rationing. They are at the point where they have to, you know, ultimately make the excruciating decisions because they don't have the resources that they would like to have too. So I think you kind of have to be realistic that they're probably, they're never going to be as forthcoming as the advocates who are going to tell you everything they know and then some, and really see you as being on their side, because most of the time the reality is in these periods they are on the defensive because they're not in a position that they like to be in.
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, this actually was around the story that Daniel's working on, is I think if you can demonstrate a structural understanding. I think in narrative, story is so good, but it's very antithetical to what drives the child welfare system. So David's he's the bubble kid, I get that. But the driver of that is actually federal policy. And so counties just sometimes can't win for losing. I mean, seriously, especially progressive county directors, like some of them. And so if you can understand that and really commit yourself to framing it that way, and then I think that would help. But even if you do that, other journalists won't. So how can they trust you? I mean, I guess then there just comes a relationship.
Sometimes talking to them when there's not a crisis, because I mean, there's nothing more frustrating for anybody who's in a public policy administration role, that when you call, they know the reality is that you've already determined the story that you're going to write, and they're going to be, you know, graph 12, you know, rationalizing it or denying it or that kind of thing.
It's kind of like New York City.
It's a good question.
If you can make it in child welfare coverage, like make it in a way that they're going to listen to you and they're going to actually respond to you. You can probably do it at any kind of other institutional coverage. Because I think that idea of being able to understand the structural constraints that they're working under is really, you know, I mean, these guys are really in tough positions. I mean, like the thing we're looking at right now. I mean, yeah, they're stuck with no money, you know? And the law says you should terminate these kids' cases at 19. So they're doing that. And, you know, it sucks for them and they look like jerks. But they're not given the money to do anything different. So unless you contextualize that, they're going to think you're an idiot. So
you mentioned immigration. I mean, it may well be all these directors. It breaks their heart that they have to, you know, be in this position of, you know, taking a young child away from a parent who has run afoul with the immigration authorities. But it's the law, and if you know, they're either compliant with the law or they're finding ways to kind of finesse around the law, and they're sure not going to want to admit that to you, because even if you do the story in a sympathetic way, Fox News may take an run with it in a different direction.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I sort of asked a similar question to that. Because I mean, I've been focusing on immigration and foster care, and they both have like common theme. They both really care about the youth, about the kids. But yet, given like this new USB 1064, which are reunite families and families, I guess what I haven't noticed is that collaboration with like human rights organizations and child welfare organizations. And now that we have realignment coming along, I mean, I could just see that collaboration and just try to protect the youth. I mean, I don't know if that's in the works or I don't know. I mean,
Well, one place I've seen it, and I think it's I think a real hidden opportunity of extended foster care is if you're an undocumented immigrant in foster care, you can apply for special immigrant juvenile status. And so it's a path to legal citizenship, which, and it's supposed to be an avenue that's pursued for all young people that have that status. And some counties are very good at it, San Diego is, and then some counties are not as good at it. But to me, there's a huge opportunity there. We just bought 3 more years to make our practice better and to help. I mean, that could be like a wonderful, one good thing foster care does. And I think on that level, there's beginning to be more collaboration, although I'm frankly half scared that it's going to become publicly aware, because helping an undocumented immigrant who's 5 get this status feels different, or may feel different in the public eye, than helping a 17-year-old get this status. But I really do think that the immigration issue and how it kind of touches up against child welfare policy is going to become just increasingly important. And I kind of see that bill in the same light as a bill a few years back, where incarcerated parents, like we, and the question is, are we really going to go there and kind of think about these people in a sophisticated, caring way or not? And we kind of started to do it with incarcerated parents, and then we kind of pulled back and said, no, so, but the immigration issue is much bigger than the issue of incarcerated parents, because most children, there's not that many people who lost their children and were incarcerated. There's a lot of parents who are incarcerated whose kids have been in foster care, but in terms of custodial moms, it's not as significant, in my opinion, as the immigration issue.
Shall we let it go?
Any last burning questions from folks?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. So I'm wondering, what are we looking for in terms of implementation at the county level? Like what are journalists looking for in terms of, or how do they know, or how do we measure whether or not they're doing a good job? I mean, I think some, we mentioned that, a child dies and then there's a lot of media coverage around that. Well, is that the indicator we're looking for of whether or not something is implemented at the county well? Like, I'm just wondering, how do we know that it's being implemented well? I mean, outcomes, especially in social services, when they're over a long period of a human being's life, are so hard to measure to begin with. So how do we know if it's being implemented well or not?
Well, the bottom line, I mean, what are we looking for? In this most simplistic way, problems. And in terms of if the programs are measurably or even anecdotally worse than they were before, then I think we will have a story that realignment is not working as advertised. Or I'm not even sure that Jerry Brown has necessarily promised that it would be better.
Right.
He's saying, let's give the locals a chance to experiment and find their best way to use the resources instead of us dictating from Sacramento. I think the other thing that I'm going to be looking at is consistency. Are there going to be counties that say, okay, well, here we're going to take a minimalist approach, and then others really do end up experimenting and innovating and really pushing for ways to do things better. the compare and contrast is always a good story. I mean, we've used the term in our editorials describing sort of the pre-reform era of foster care, is we used the headline accidents of geography. And depending on where you were born in the state, where you grew up in the state, you could have a dramatically different experience in foster care. If that is the case, if we go back to that, I know that it is a story that we will be intensely interested in terms of the media in general. I mean, it's harder to say. I mean, obviously television does not have the resources that even newspapers in our stressed state right now have. I don't think there's a TV station in the Bay Area that has as many reporters as there are people in this room. I mean, even around this table. In fact, I would be surprised. And in terms of reporters who are out there covering things, I mean, they tend to follow other coverage. I know the San Jose Mercury News, far be it for me to speak well of a competitor, but they also did some very significant work in foster care, and I think you get that combination. But I think that's what we're going to be looking for, is disparities, problems. I mean, hopefully it's not going to be a situation where children are dying and that's what gets the media's interest. But the fact of the matter is, in foster care, one of the big problems was, that there was no tracking statewide of child deaths, and it's one of the reforms that came through in this. There could be patterns that the state was totally unaware of, and so I think that those are the elements that we'll be looking for.
And I would just add, I think our statewide database is really under analyzed. The CSSR database, I mean, you just need to spend time with it, and the allegations are flat from 2000. The removals are down 50%. You're going to get a lot of questions that can lead you in directions. What's the variability between the reentry? I mean, I know that there's just a lot of information there, and if you just spend time with it, you'll start to form, why is it this way? And it's a fair question. It is such a rich trove of data that is largely unmined.
But I would just add that one of the threats for realignment is that database specifically comes from data that has to be reported because the state requires it. What actually is required at a federal level is much less. So now that the state's out of the game, how long will that survive? That data is up for a question. Yeah. And it also doesn't capture, like you said, this has come up before, the story of the kids who don't get removed then. So
we've built to try and basically change that and make a more public health type of accountability system. But that is being, heavily opposed, obviously, by the counties. At this point, I mean, it could change. But our hope would certainly be, to me, that system is more important than ever because it gives people like you an opportunity to comb through it and just to see what's going on here. This is interesting. For local coverage, it's all county-based, or even compared to the state. I mean, there's so much information in there, and I don't think it gets the eyes that it needs.
Okay, guys. Well, thank you very much again.